Hello, we're gathered today here in St Swithin's Church, Woodbury, and I'm going to give you a short presentation on the subject of a century in Woodbury. This picture depicts the arch as it was in 1904, and I live in the house on the left beside the green tree with the red berries. This is a holly tree, and as you can see it was there in 1904 and it is still there today. So it's probably something like 200 years old. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am, a little bit about the photographic archive that I have set up, and a little bit about photo restoration. And then we get on to the real story of Woodbury folk. Back in the 1940s, tractors like this could be seen traversing Woodbury's village, and there were some strange characters floating around. And in the 1900s, early 1900s, this little lot could be seen in the village on numerous occasions, and no, they were not the parish council. This is our family tree, which goes back to 1535. And there's been a direct line of the Stokes family in the village since that point in time. However, back in the 1800s, one member decided to branch off and go to Canada and set up there, and there are still just one or two Stokeses left in Canada. If we look at this red line, this is the line of my great-grandfather, Harry. And he was one of 8 children. John here, he went off to Herefordshire and set up a family branch there who I've never actually met. William Mitchell went off to London to try to make his fortune, but eventually died in the Paddington workhouse. And Alfred is recorded as being a master tailor in the workhouse at Nottingham, where he was on the staff. The last 4 generations of the family have revolved around one single male to keep it going, and I am the last of the single males, I think, and but we have managed to keep it going from there. The photographic archive I set up in 1999 when I was doing my book Woodbury the 20th Century Revisited. It seems such a shame to waste all these photos. I had a lot and many were available within the village. So they've all been scanned and they are now kept on an electronic database. This is the oldest one I have, which is the inside of this church in 1863 with the choir singing. In the process there's been the need for a bit of photo restoration. Some of the photos came to me like this, rather torn and dull and gloomy, and with a bit of help we can get them back to their former glory. And this is John James Glanville of Ryden Farm. If you look at the other picture you'll see he's only got 1 foot, and this is John Francis, his son. So to give him another foot, we have to take a copy of this one and flip it over on the computer and stick it back on the bottom of his leg. Similar with the tree or the bush in the garden, and similar with the plaster on the wall. So eventually you finish up with quite a decent photograph. In 1900 we have this list of names which appears quite often in the village. And who are they? No, they are not the parish council, but they are the members of the Woodbury Fire Brigade of the time. They were in fact paid by the parish council, but they were not really organised by them. The records of the fire brigade still exist, and you can see here This is the annual retainer fee, where Captain Abbott was paid £1 a year as being in charge, and the rest of the firemen were paid 10 shillings. This was just their retainer. If they went out on a job, this one was to the Vicarage Hayrick Fire at Aylesbury in July 1904. They were all paid a little more, and there were quite a few others. There's a messenger, there's pumpers, there's horse hire, and there's repair of damage to the fire engine if it occurred, and some refreshments. Woodbury's always been associated with the military, and the Royal Devon Yeomanry in around 1910 spent a lot of time having camps on Woodbury Common. Everything was horsepower driven, as you can see, and it was obviously very hard work to set up all the tentage. And they seemed to even have to provide a band for the Sunday service, and to get all this equipment there must have been an enormous task. This is John Francis Glanville, who we saw earlier on in the other photo. He's seen here outside Ryden Farm on his horse, ready to go off to the common on one of the yeomanry camps. And similarly at Woodbury Salterton, Frank Turner here is seen on a horse loaned to him by George Wilson, ready to go off to camp as well. It was always a boy's dream to be part of the Royal Devon Yeomanry. The ladies around 1900 were very smart ladies, and this is Annie and Nellie Pine from Postlake Farm, and this is Mary Rue and Emma, two sisters of my great-grandfather, the photograph which was taken in about 1865. All nice girls like a soldier in this case. And this is Elizabeth Frances Lawrence, the lady, who is seen with John Edwin Hitchcock on their wedding day, the 1st of April 1896 at Hampstead in London. John was a member of the Coldstream Guards. And this is John's mother, Asenath Hitchcock, renowned to be an excellent lace maker, but she looks rather stern, and I'm not sure what quite of mother-in-law she made. This is John again in his full regalia of the Coldstream Guards, in his ceremonial dress. He was invalided out in 1902 after being shot and wounded in the Boer War, and unfortunately died shortly afterwards. But his son followed on and joined the Coldstream Guards later on. This is Harry Stokes, my great-grandfather and grandfather. They ran a church bell hanging business within the village, and this is their visiting card. They travelled all over the country and got as far as York Minster, where they fixed up a chiming apparatus invented by the Reverend Ellicombe, rector of Clisson George at the time. So in those days, the 4th of April 1882, it must have been quite a trek to have got all the way to York. This is his team of bell hangers and forgers and carpenters, and the team which would have helped in the production of the bell frames. This is great-grandfather Stokes, and this is my grandfather, who of course I knew. And this is the sort of frame that they made. This is shown here in the yard at Fernley, just below the village hall, and obviously this is an oak frame destined for East Tynmouth, and obviously they had to put it together here to see if it would all fit before they took it down to the church. So they had to put it together and take it apart again for transportation. And here in the yard also at Fernley, they eventually moved from oak frames onto cast iron frames, with their name cast in the side, and this particular peal of bells is destined for St Michael Carehays in Cornwall, and the date on the frame here is 1914. And if we look at the next picture, which I did see in the year 2002, this very same frame is still in the tower at St Michael Carehays in Cornwall. Following the demise of the bell hanging business, the premises at Fernley were taken over by the Vickery family, who made carts and wagons for the agricultural industry in the locality, and they went on for many years. Following that, the premises were taken over by furniture makers until quite recently. The local garage was run by the Berry family, and this picture is taken in 1901. George Berry was one time captain of the fire brigade in the early days, and the family in general stayed within the village, and they operated the garage, which many of you will remember, but has now somewhat disappeared. This is where, at the time, you could probably buy petrol for 1 and 5 pence a gallon, somewhat different to today. And inside the garage there was a forge. They did all sorts of metalwork, and all the bits and pieces hanging on the wall are very intriguing. They also made water wheels, and this one resides now in a flower bed at Exmouth beside the Imperial Hotel, and it came from Withycombe Mills on the outskirts of Exmouth. This was Goss's hygienic steam bakery at the bottom of Flower Street. I remember it better as Sowersby's. The Sowersby's obviously followed on from them, and this picture is also at the turn of the century. In the middle of the 20th century, Woodbury sported some 20 to 30 businesses in the village, and this is a list of most of them. There were 3 bakers, 3 butchers, an ironmonger, who's still here of course, builders, undertakers, the 2 pubs are still here, and Pratt's the florist at Exton, other stores and shops and tea rooms, taxi and cattle haulier, and there was even a fish and fruit merchant. And Woodbury Mills, of course more latterly run by Eric Ware, was a major outputter of animal food in the middle of the 20th century. The street scene in 1900 was somewhat different to today. This is at the crossroads looking up Broadway, and on the right you can see an old Tudor house. This was subsequently demolished to put the new post office, and across the road you just have orchards. And if we look at the same photo in 1914, you'll see now the new post office is being built here, and Canada Cottage has been built here, complete with balcony and balustrade. And it's in this house here, Broadway House, where my own father was born. If we look the other way, looking up towards Globe Hill, just a few years later, you can now see that the balustrade at Canada Cottages has now disappeared, just leaving the floor, and later photos show it all gone as it is today. So things are changing. Just a little further up Broadway, you have a nice earth type road, hardcore road. Most of these houses are still in existence except the one on the very right, which has been demolished and replaced. The Globe Inn here, which was situated at the top of Globe Hill on the crossroads to Ryden Lane, was the main meeting point for villagers and the yeomanry for many, many years. It was centuries old, but it sadly burnt to the ground in 1916. This was the original post office run by the Daly family until 1912, when it moved across the road into its new premises. From here, William Daly used to send Morse messages in the good old days before the telephones came into existence. Woodbury had a pound in the early part of the century where any stray cattle would be put and reclaimed again, I assume, for the figure of £1. This eventually fell into disrepair and was demolished and replaced by the stone cross which is currently there. This old house, the Leaches, was there in my youth, and I remember it until about the 1960s, when it was demolished as unfit for human habitation. This also happened to Govitz, which was just above Christchurch. That also was demolished because it was apparently unfit to live in. This is quite a unique photo because you have a person here who is taking a photograph of a group of children here, and obviously there's another photograph back this side taking a photograph of the whole scene. This is a view towards the school around 1930, and you have Mrs. Clapp's tea shop, sweet shop on the right hand side, and the children are coming out of school and all heading towards the sweet shop. This was a regular occurrence, and I can remember doing it myself. In 1932 we had the Jubilee of the King and Queen, and there are, I think, at least 3 people on this wagon who are still with us. This one is Joyce Sowersby. This one, I believe, was Joyce Biddulph, who is Joyce Biddulph now. And this was Dennis Goss, who last count was living at Pinhoe. The arch was always decorated for any type of Jubilee event or return from the Boer War, and everybody stood out and had a good old chatter, something which obviously cannot be done anymore. Early agriculture revolved around horsepower, and apart from having your own horse to work your own implements, horses were bred for the army, and this postcard, which I had in my possession, did have one for the army written on the back of it. And this is Will Havel at Higher Mallock's farm. The ladies of the early 20th century were keen to learn, particularly domestic skills, and there were many classes organised by Devon County Council in butter making, cheese making, poultry trussing and the like. And this photograph was taken at one such event. At the end there would be a little competition, and you would get a certificate to say you'd been there, and at the bottom it says what prize you were awarded, and this was a card awarded to my grandmother in 1910. A similar photo here at a cheese making class, and this is taken outside the village hall in about 1915. The little boy in the front with the dog is my father, and his mother is in the back row, right hand corner, just standing in the doorway. There was a cutting in the newspaper which I came across when I was doing my book, which was rather pertinent to the butter making competitions, and the judge obviously had some doubts about what was going on, and it's quite an interesting thing just to read. Down at Gilbrook it was harvest time, and an all more leisurely approach than it would be today, and there again horsepower was in top gear, and here we have a 2 horsepower reaper going. And after the harvest everything has to be put into ricks and subsequently thrashed to get the grain from the straw, and this was a gathering at Cornish's farm. And of course Rover the dog here being one of the most important aspects of this, because he caught the rats as they ran out from the bottom of the ricks. Down at Gulliford farm similar was happening, and here ricks are being made following the bringing in of the sheaves of corn by the horse and wagon in the middle there, and subsequently the rick had to have a roof put on it like this, like the one on the left. And I think we can see Mrs. Hallett here with her 2 daughters, making sure that they didn't finish up on the top of the rick with 1 or 2 of the 3 men who are at the bottom of the ladder, although one lady seems to be 3/4 of the way up already. Later on at Gulliford the steam engine and thrasher would come, and thrashing, as in the Woodbury photo, would take place to take the grain from the straws. These are really unique photos. And outside Webber's farm in Bonfire Lane, pigs could wander quite freely from there up to the path fields. They all knew their way, and traffic was not a problem. The village hall was originally a Methodist chapel which was bought from Topsham, and at November the 5th 1909 a whip round took place at the annual bonfire on the green, and £300 was raised, and the following year the Woodbury Public Hall Company was incorporated, of which my grandfather was one of the directors. And people who loaned money in the form of bonds were given a share certificate. These were later redeemed when monies became available. During the 40s and 50s, the carnivals were a major part of the social year in Woodbury. Each carnival had a queen, princesses and the mayor, and this picture is taken inside the old village hall at the crowning of one of these queens, the queen here being Betty Vickery, I believe. And Patsy Marks is seen here as another queen on the Queen's trailer, which always headed the procession around the village. And this young lady is still in the village. She is now Pauline Westaway. And Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs here, and this little dwarf happens to be me many years ago, and this little dwarf happens to be Bob Miller, the local painter and decorator, and both of us are somewhat older now. Oh, and this is a damaged picture and it has a hole in it. Well, let's see what we can do. This is where our floating friend comes into things and plugs the gap. Woodbury's had many characters over the years, and this is Parson Fulford, photographed in 1895 on his tricycle, and he used to go up and down the road to the church and back to the parsonage with this mode of transport. And this is Veera Perry, as she was then. Veera used to like her motorcycle in the good old days, and she was the daughter of Perrys, who had the bakery in Woodbury. And when she was working, Veera would look like this on the right, selling her wares off of a hand cart. I believe this photograph was also taken in Broadway with her cousin Dolly, who finished up as Dolly Dell, a fine seamstress who lived in the village. And this is the mayoral transport of Percy Stediford, whom Veera Perry married. So in the end we had Veera and Percy Stediford, and Percy was the life and soul of any party or event. He was a really outgoing man, and he quite often used to put up for the position of mayor, which had to be obtained by selling the most penny votes in any one season. And this little chap up here is also me. Perhaps this is where I got my interest for history from. And this is Veera and Percy Stediford in their older age. I always think it is difficult when you look at an old person walking down the road. You are inclined to think that they are just an old person and have never done anything, and their age belies what they have done. And behind every old person, undoubtedly, there is an interesting story. Maudie Yeo took on from Percy Stediford in the sort of mayor role. It was quite a battle in those days, and she's seen here on her mayoral transport, which is not quite so plush, with her megaphone. And the young man in this picture, the picture which comes from Exton, is in fact Bill Pratt, who now looks more like this, being the gentleman on the left receiving a long service award from the Woodbury News back before last Christmas. And a major character in Woodbury over the years has been Bert Short, alias Bert Marks. His story is too long to tell here, but he was a remarkable character and certainly didn't like to live in a house. Joan Selleck, who many of us will remember, lived beside us at Webber's Farm for many, many years. She was a Cockney, and she was evacuated at the beginning of the war to Woodbury, and she eventually married Trixie, who finished up as a Woodbury postman. She was very forthright, but she had a heart of gold, and she's sorely missed. Also Bert Stamp, who was the father of John at Woodbury House. He was a major character in the middle of the century. Bert used to have a pony and trap. The pony was called Kit, and he had two traps, one a milk float and one a governess cart, and he used to like to take children for rides around the village in his governess cart, maybe on a Sunday. And this is a photograph of Bert again and John with their two dogs outside Woodbury House just before the end of the last war. And you see fine railings, and John said to me that the railings were taken away just 2 or 3 days before the end of the war, and he thinks they were probably never melted down to make bullets, and it's such a shame that they have disappeared. And this is Reggie Bishop, seen here making a set of stairs. Reg was a major craftsman. He was a wheelwright, and he could do anything, and his workshop was equally full of tools as the Berries. So some characters still have to be made, and this one of the two boys sat on the gate here. Both were evacuees from London in 1939. The photograph is taken at Higher Venmore Farm, and One of those is Reg Brown, who's well known nowadays, and it was always Reggie's wish one day to buy the farm, to which he was evacuated, and this ultimately, after a long and illustrious teaching career, the farm became available and he bought it and has refurbished the whole place. Woodbury people like to have their outings in their charabancs in the early days. It must have been a bumpy ride, but the vicar went along also, and they went to all sorts of places, including Cheddar Caves. And those of you who were in Woodbury in the 1950s, maybe up to the 1960s, will remember Miller's Tours, who was the local coach company from Exmouth, who, if you wanted a bus, you gave them a ring. In the good old days, Woodbury sported 4 or 5 herds of cows, all which would traverse the village daily, leaving their droppings on the road, which would be picked up by householders to put on their tomatoes. And this is Stamp's cows probably going down the road past Woodbury House, now minus its railings, for milking in behind. And in 1871 the new school was built, and this picture depicts the final touches being put. Just to the right you can see some men still on scaffolding, but the school then moved from the Beals up to here, and it was a major building with lovely chimneys and a bell turret. Woodbury has seen quite a bit of the elements over the years. In 1960 we had serious floods, and this picture shows the demise of Exton Church, which was a cob-built church which was just washed away and demolished by the floods. In 1963 we had major snow in the winter, and the temperature never rose above freezing point the whole of January, day or night. In the 1990s we had the Great Storm, and the great tree of Woodbury Salterton was alas no longer great, its roots not being able to hold it up. And over the century there are many reports of fires on Woodbury Common, and this is one of the worst of them in the 1980s. But there have been some brighter moments, and this picture, although it might seem somewhat frivolous, is now part of Woodbury's history. And during the 70s and 80s there was a group which called themselves the Woodbury Happening, which put on a show once a year and had a barbecue, and it was a good time for all. Throughout the century there's been a lot of change in Woodbury. In 1973 there was a move by the Clinton Estates to put a golf course on Woodbury Common, which was very much opposed, and Alan Toyne, who lived here at the time, then became chairman of a Hands Off the Common committee, and in the ultimate they were successful in stopping this golf course being built actually out over on the common. And this picture shows Alan Toyne addressing a crowd at a gathering at Woodbury Castle, with television cameramen also there present. It was a major campaign and fought very successfully. In 1983 a major development took place in Woodbury which was called the Golden Heart. It was nicknamed the Golden Heart, and certain people did not like the idea of a pathway coming out opposite the green, and one dark night a breeze block wall was put up which nobody has ever removed. We all know who did it, but it's still there. Change. A lot of this has taken place since the 60s. If we just go through it quickly, We have the village hall here that's been expanded and modernised, and therefore we can cover that bit. Next door there was an orchard, which is now the village car park. Here behind the butcher's shop, this is now being developed, and here there were 4 farm workers' cottages. These have now been turned into 2 more upmarket dwellings. Tom Henley used to live here in this old house at Hayden's. Tom was a roadman at the time, but that was there in my youth, but it was demolished in the early 60s and replaced by more modern houses. This garden has been built on. There was a little shop at the end of Flower Street, and that is all gone and been replaced by cottages. And the Goss's Steam bakery front to the bakery there has also disappeared, but I can remember buying bread inside it. The whole of the Webbers Farm complex, where I was born and brought up, was developed in 1984 by the Clinton Devon Estates, and so this area has now been totally covered with houses. And Joan and Trixie Selleck's old house has now been very tastefully renovated, and when finally finished it will be superb. And lastly, there are workshops where my grandfather carried out his bell hanging business, and the vicary's followed on. It's just about to be demolished, rather sadly, and 3 houses are going to be put into there. So you can see, out of just one small picture, more than half of it has been changed in the last 40 to 50 years. But that is, I take it, what makes history. And finally, in August 1915, this old bus appeared on the arch, and about 10 years later this young lady could be seen riding on the arch on this horse. The bus went on its merry way, and the young lady grew and grew, and she was joined by a young man who also grew and grew, and they went their separate ways. The thing is, do you know who they are? Well, the young boy was this young man, Eric Ware, and the young lady was this young lady, now Esme Thompson. Esme is of course cousin to Eric, and it's from people like this that I've gained a lot of knowledge and had a lot of photographs, and it is people like this who make the history of a place. And more importantly, these 2 are still with us, and my thanks are to them for all they have done to help me in my photographic process.